On this episode of Newt's World, who is the real Kamala Harris, and how did she ascend to the second highest office in the country? Despite her limited experience in national politics and confusing professional history, there hasn't been a comprehensive examination of Vice President Kamala Harris's journey to the White House until now. In his new book, Amateur Hour: Kamala Harris in the White House, author Charlie Spiering delivers the first ever deep dive into Kamala Harris's incompetent, radical path to the vice presidency. From her tenure as California prosecutor, to serving the United States Senate, to her failed presidential campaign, and finally her first years in an executive office as vice president. Amateur Hour was published in January this year, but has become a must-read for everyone watching the ascension of Vice President Harris to the Democratic nominee for president. Here to discuss his new book, I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, Charlie Spiering. He began his career as a political journalist 15 years ago as a reporter for Washington Post columnist Robert Novak. He was a political writer for the Washington Examiner before moving to Breitbart News as a White House correspondent covering the Obama administration and the Trump administration. Charlie, welcome and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Thank you for having me, Mr. Speaker. It's a real honor.
You know, there's been a lot of reporting about various aspects of Kamala Harris's life and political career since President Biden announced he was no longer running in 2024, and she became the presumptive nominee of the Democrats' ticket. But I have to say, your book is remarkable because you tell her story from the very beginning. So, let's talk about Harris's early life. Tell us a little bit about how she grew up.
Right. I think most people know Kamala Harris's early life through the lens of her debate moment with then Vice President Joe Biden during the 2020 presidential campaign, when Kamala Harris famously turned to the former vice president and spoke to him about how difficult it was to grow up in relatively liberal enclave of San Francisco and struggling with the issue of racial segregation and public busing, and how she was the benefactor of that. And I think a lot of people kind of saw that attack as disingenuous, as someone who, you know, as many people in California understood her story, they didn't really see her painting herself as a victim as very effective because, you know, she did grow up in a well-to-do neighborhood in San Francisco, the daughter of two academics. You know, her father was famously an economic professor for Stanford University, and her mother was a cancer researcher. And ultimately, even though they separated when Kamala was still young, she still enjoyed sort of the benefits of living in a very progressive, well-to-do environment.
I'm curious because apparently, from the very beginning, her parents were part of the radical Afro-American Association study group at Berkeley, and in a sense, she was born into her radicalism.
Right. She frequently talks about her parents as being progressive activists who were out there marching and shouting for justice. But looking back, it's a little more nuanced than that. They spent more of their time in an academic setting. You know, her father, Donald Harris, was a pretty prominent voice for economic studies, and he held several Marxist views when it came to economics. He was part of this study group, which was pretty radical. It gave the rise to the Black Panther Party and Black nationalism and the importance of that movement during the civil rights era. So there was a lot of intellectual underpinnings, not just a simple marching and shouting for justice, as Harris likes to talk about. She frequently talks about her life, you know, being pushed around in a stroller by her parents at some of these protests, and even sort of changing her description of that example. In her early years, she would talk about how she used to fall out of her stroller when her parents were pushing her around at these protests. And then later in life, she kind of changed that to describe herself as strapped tightly in her stroller, much more safe position. And then she would also talk about how the rise of the civil rights movement sort of created who she was, molded her into who she was. So that's certainly a narrative she's pushed ever since she got into national politics.
But as I understand it, her parents separated at 5 and divorced when she was 7, and her mother, Shyamala Gopalan, actually raised her.
Exactly. Kamala Harris describes herself as being raised by strong women. Her single mom definitely raised her 2 daughters, but she was also away at work a lot. Kamala talks a lot about spending a lot of time on her own or with a neighbor who they described as their second mother. Her second mother, Regina Shelton, has the heritage of the Black South, so Kamala Harris leans on that an awful lot when she's talking about Black issues, because her mother is an Indian American. So she was described as, the first mother is off at work doing cancer research. The second mother is raising Kamala and the girls in her spare time, taking them to a Baptist church, etc.
She also went to the Shiva Vishnu temple in Livermore, which is a totally different experience from going to a Baptist church.
Right. Kamala's mother would talk about raising Harris in the Hindu community when she was running for office in San Francisco, which has a pretty prominent Indian community. So she had kind of leaned on both of these experiences. She talked about going to a Black Christian church, and she also talked about going to church at the Hindu temple and performing all the different ceremonies. When she was first inaugurated in her first office, it was very much a combination of these 2 shared life experiences.
When she's an early teenager, her mother gets a job at McGill University teaching in the medical department and researching cancer at the Jewish General Hospital. So part of her teenage years she spends in Montreal.
Exactly. And this is why some people sort of attribute her inability to connect with the basic American experience on this time that she spent in her formative years in Montreal. Certainly, Canada is not the United States of America. It's much different. And she went to a pretty well-off school in a well-off neighborhood, and she had a home in a pretty well-off location. So she experienced this life through much of her formative teenage years, joining a dance troupe, experiencing high school and in dances, and not many controversies in her early life as a teenager.
Well, of course, Montreal is part of Quebec, which is a French-speaking area, and she actually was sent to a French school, Notre Dame des Neiges, before she ended up at Westmount High School, which she graduated from in Canada.
Right. This is not the normal experience of a public school student in America. She was attending some of the more well-off elite schools and getting a pretty solid education.
So in your judgment, why does she then go to college at Howard University, which is the oldest of the historically Black universities, founded right after the Civil War by General Howard? Why do you think she picked Howard as the place to go to?
She speaks fondly of this woman mentor that she had, who she calls Aunt Christine, someone who had also been to a historic Black university and got a job as a lawyer and moved into law. So Kamala, when she's growing up, she sees that path as a path to success, something she can do, easily shift into the law and have a professional career that doesn't necessarily require being an activist. Her family, she famously talks about her family being surprised when they found out she was interested in moving into law and becoming a public prosecutor. She always would talk about, in a defensive way, that perhaps my decision to become a prosecutor will give me the chance to reform the system from the inside.
While she's at Howard, she manages to join the AKA sorority. And as I understand it, sororities like that in the Black community play a much bigger role than they do in the white community. And therefore, by being invited in, she actually is in a network that will dramatically help her over the years.
Exactly. Kamala Harris still has a very strong connection to that sorority, which is not only just a friendship, it's a very professional relationship with the different sisters of the sorority, which is why she remains very close with the people in the sorority. But it also kind of has that guarded attempt of protecting each other and setting each other up for financial and professional success. And just recently, we saw Harris deliver a speech to her sorority, choosing instead to do that rather than attend Bibi Netanyahu's speech in Congress. That's one more example of how she values her sorority more than most would as a lost aspect from a college era.
And apparently she was able to do a telephone conference call with some 40,000 Black women sorority members around the country, not just that sorority, but the Divine Nine came together so that all the major sororities and fraternities seem to now be unified in their support for her.
Absolutely. It's the kind of close-knit professional network, not very large, but very connected, especially in Washington, D.C., as we saw her as an African-American politician move quickly up the ladders of power and places of influence within the Senate.
She graduates from Howard and then goes back across the country and goes to the University of California, Hastings College of the Law. And then she has her first major roadblock.
When she finally graduated, she took the bar and failed the first time she tried. And she writes in her memoir that she felt, really disappointed, but she had only delivered in what she called a, quote, half-assed performance in her entire life up to this point. So it was really a point where she was met with failure, but still had a clerking position in the Alameda County District Attorney's Office. They didn't push her out or fire her because of her failure. And she was able to retake the bar exam and pass the second time.
Well, and technically, it's not that unusual for someone to fail the first time. That's not automatically a gigantic black mark. It's interesting that she doesn't go into private sector law firms. She doesn't pursue the big dollars. She goes into the county district attorney's office. And in that process, she's single. She begins dating Willie Brown, who I think may have been the smartest person ever to serve as Speaker in California. Just a remarkable figure. He was Speaker of the House in California for 15 years, from 1980 to 1995. She's 29, Brown's 60. They have a close relationship, and Brown appoints her to 2 positions in state government that all told paid her more than $400,000 over 5 years. A pretty good relationship at giving her a launch.
Right. She took a sort of a 6-month leave of absence from her Alameda County job to join these positions that Willie Brown appointed her to while they were having a relationship. He appointed her to the California Medical Assistance Commission, which had 2 meetings a month for a $99,000 annual salary. And then later she got another position, which paid another significant salary. So yeah, all told, more than $400,000, which back in the 90s, you adjust that for inflation, it's nearly $1 million in just running these temporary state board positions. And all the while, Willie Brown also gave her the keys to a BMW to help, drive her around and conduct her business. So it was really not only a financial leg up, but also a personal one. As she was dating Willie Brown opened the doors for her to all the, the most well-connected, powerful, wealthy people in San Francisco. Not just them, but all the celebrities too. So he really opened the doors and kicked off her political career just through this 1-year relationship that he had with Kamala Harris when he was running for mayor at the same time.
And in that period, once he's mayor, Brown gets mad at his district attorney, Terrence Hallinan, and Harris decides to run for DA. And she wins, taking office in 2004, with the strongest single person in the city backing her.
Right. It's a very interesting story, the story of Hallinan, because Terrence Hallinan first hired Kamala Harris from the Alameda County when Brown won the position for mayor. It was widely seen as a nod to the mayor, like, I'm hiring somebody who's in your orbit to work for me. But when Kamala Harris got to the office, she was famously aggressive and abrasive with the employees there. She tried to lead a coup against the second in command in Hallinan's office. And ultimately that failed. She was unable to push out sort of Hallinan's deputy, prompting her to leave the department entirely, take a job with the city attorney, and plot her revenge. So a few people were surprised when Kamala Harris announced her decision to tackle Terrence Hallinan for the position of district attorney in San Francisco. And the campaign was famously very, very aggressive and very ugly, as when 2 Democrats are fighting each other in a very liberal and progressive town.
Well, and it gives you some sense of how much Willie Brown was invested, there's a quote from the San Francisco Neighborhood Newspaper Association. This is Willie Brown now. Quote, "That son of a bitch should have been recalled by the very people who are currently outraged. I'm more disgusted than you'll ever believe." And Brown then goes on to personally give $500 to Harris's campaign and gives a letter which political consultants use to raise money, because Brown is clearly, having been the longest-serving speaker in the history of California, is now clearly the most powerful single person in San Francisco. And she basically was running as his protege. I mean, she can't get away from being his protege, it seems to me.
Right. She struggled with this question throughout her campaign, because Hallinan and his allies were pointing to Harris as, just Willie Brown's former arm candy, and kept saying that not only was Willie Brown corrupt, but that Kamala Harris could be corrupted by Willie Brown, because Willie Brown was a very powerful politician, but he also moved easily in the halls of power and didn't let a few, just like the experience with Harris shows you, that he didn't mind a little appearance of political impropriety. He was thoroughly investigated by the FBI throughout his career, but was never charged with anything, showing he was pretty smart at how he navigated those waters. But yeah, when it came time for Harris to distance herself from Willie Brown, she ultimately made the decision late in her campaign to throw Willie Brown under the bus, working through this profile with San Francisco Magazine. Really, the first time she publicly addressed the Willie Brown problem, that people were calling it, and really just threw him under the bus, saying his career is over, move on, he's in the past, it's time to move on. And it was very effective in sort of turning the California socialites against this sort of Willie Brown attacks and for Kamala Harris as an independent politician.
She is so determined to erase Willie Brown's role in her career that when she writes her 2019 political memoir, she doesn't mention him once. I mean, this is the guy who picked her up, got her 2 great appointments, helped her win the DA's job, and she doesn't mention him one time.
Right. The Harris campaign famously has not addressed the Willie Brown question since this time. Anytime any reporter asks a question about Willie Brown, her staff point to this magazine article as the moment that she separated herself from Brown and refuses to talk about it ever again. She really tried to push Willie Brown completely out of her orbit. And anytime that Willie Brown pipes up to talk about Kamala Harris, it's not received well at all by Kamala Harris and her team.
She's now the DA. What kind of a district attorney was she?
During the campaign, she famously campaigned against Hallinan as sort of an ineffective progressive. She would gather on the steps with people of color, with women, and, victims of Hallinan's failure to prosecute, and really campaign on him failing women and minorities. And so her line on this was, we don't have to be tough on crime or weak on crime. We just have to be smart on crime. That was her campaign message, campaigning a little bit to the right of Terrence Hallinan. And at the same time, after she won the office, she immediately shifted a little more towards the progressive model that Hallinan had already enacted. Right away, she was really criticized by the police department after she failed to pursue the death penalty for a cop killer, something that really angered even the more basic law and order people in San Francisco. Even Dianne Feinstein publicly criticized her decision during the funeral for the police officer where she spoke. And so Harris really started out of the gate as a very progressive prosecutor, just like the one she replaced.
She does something else which is fascinating. She wants to have a really high conviction rate. And she gets it by simply not trying cases. So unless it's a slam dunk, she's not going to take the risk. It seems to me that the degree to which she was willing to cut a deal with people who were engaged in homicide in order to minimize losing the cases is kind of amazing.
Right. We're kind of familiar with this practice now in this modern era of the George Soros-funded prosecutors that people pay attention to so much. But Harris really at this point is specifically And she was called out in the newspapers for this very interesting trend of, juicing her conviction rates by prosecuting less. And it was certainly a practice that was done in the previous administration, but it was something that she really polished up and used it to promote her record and run for her future office.
So she's basically the pioneer of turning criminals back on the street, while she's able to say, look at my conviction record, because she only tries people she can convict. But she goes a step further. I was really surprised by this. This is a tribute to your research, that as early as 2008, she's promoting San Francisco as a sanctuary city. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's right. I think most California politicians, despite their basic attempts to portray themselves as, smart on crime, they very much understand the importance of being a sanctuary city. She and, at the time, Mayor Gavin Newsom were also focused on preserving this idea that, a sanctuary city was going to continue in San Francisco. Her record on immigration is also very interesting because she famously had this reform program allowing, some of these first-time offenders to get into a program that would help them find a career and move on and reform their lives instead of going to prison, and to move on and try to find employment and education. This program famously had issues because illegal immigrants were being put into this program, and some of these illegals were going on to commit further crimes. So it was also a politically thorny issue for her program.
So in a way, though, she's the forerunner of what will happen under Biden, and she's already doing it herself.
Exactly. The Biden policy of just allowing illegal immigrants and migrants to freely flow over the border, that was already completely baked into California politics.
Something I don't understand here, maybe you can explain California to me. She's soft on murderers because she wants to have a good conviction rate. So she cuts all sorts of deals. And in fact, I think based on your research, she gets a backlog of 73 homicide cases. She cuts a deal for 32 of them, and she only convicts 15 out of 73. So on the one hand, she's being soft. She's soft on illegal immigrants and wants San Francisco to be a sanctuary city. And then she talks about prosecuting parents of truant children, threatening them with a $2,500 fine and up to a year in jail. How do you balance out, I'm going to lock up your parents if you don't come to school, and by the way, I'm going to release the murderer down the street, and I don't mind if there are illegal immigrants here because we're a sanctuary city? That's a pretty complicated message.
Right. Harris started pursuing this idea as she began eyeing statewide office. In California, you famously have to choose your political alliances just right so that you're a little to the right of a radical leftist, but a little to the left of a potential Republican challenger. So this is right before her decision to run for attorney general. And she makes this decision, and she notes that it was very controversial among her staff to make this decision to prosecute parents for truant children. And the big thing is she was out there promoting this as part of her smart on crime agenda, using it to sort of appeal to parents of different political stripes. Even though she was threatening them with a fine, it was all in favor of this idea that social activism through government to get more people into schools so that there was less crime, noting that truant children were more likely to commit crimes. The solution, she says, was to sort of terrorize and frighten parents with the threat of jail time, with this idea that they needed to send their truant children to school. And there was some moderate decreases of truant children after this, allowing her to promote this as a major success for her smart on crime persona.
In the middle of all this, there's a huge scandal in her second term as DA, which involves the crime lab. Can you describe what happened and why it was a big deal?
During her second term, there was a crime worker who was, convicted and jailed for domestic violence and chronic absences. And the prosecutors in her department knew her work was unreliable and sort of flagged their office. And then there were also reports of this employee skimming cocaine from the drug lab for her personal use. And so this is currently going on, and the district attorney's office is aware of it. And then suddenly the city's head public defender finds out about this and blasts Harris's office for failing to disclose this. Because if you have somebody like this, then they're an unreliable person, witness to participate into a criminal trial. So when Harris was confronted with this, she claimed that she had no idea what was going on, even though her top staff had been emailed this information. And Harris has thoroughly no record about doing this or even knowing about it. She claims she knows nothing about it. This leaves hundreds of cases on the book, these drug cases. They're suddenly in jeopardy because the district attorney's office didn't reveal this unreliable crime lab worker. And as each case gets resolved, it's over and over and over again, more of these cases are being challenged. And instead of addressing it directly, Harris famously just dismissed all cases involving this crime lab worker and just cutting it off quickly so she could move past the scandal. But at the same time, police officers who had delivered like these significant cases against major drug crime criminals, suddenly those cases were dismissed. Even some already in prison who had already been convicted, she suddenly vacates them all and get thrown out.
So her inability to manage leads to a huge scandal that releases an amazing number of drug dealers. But now, in the middle of all this, while she has some local problems, she also is beginning to have a relationship that will ultimately really matter, and that's with Barack Obama. Can you describe how she and Obama related in the early stages of his presidency?
Kamala Harris was one of the few California politicians. She was already seen as a rising star, but she was already someone who had decided to endorse Barack Obama when he was first running for office instead of Hillary Clinton, which most of the California politicians sided with Clinton because they had a very powerful operation in the state. But Harris famously endorsed Obama instead. She even went to Iowa and spent time with Obama, helping campaign for him. This is the local district attorney, but Obama rewarded her quite well because of her loyalty. And when he ended up winning, Harris really saw this experience as a chance to further bolster her political career going up in California.
So in that process, she ends up getting invited to a White House state dinner for the Indian prime minister.
Right. This was in 2009. So it was just one more example of how Harris was very good at networking and leveraging her political alliances to get top billing as a potential future Democratic star.
Now, she takes a real gamble, it seems to me, in deciding to run statewide for attorney general. I mean, California is a huge state. To win statewide is not a small thing. What's your take on Kamala Harris as the statewide candidate back then?
She substantially positioned herself just enough, not necessarily as radical as she was when she first started her office, but she really worked towards being a little more right of left, I guess we could say, as she decided to challenge Steve Cooley for the position of Attorney General of California. Steve Cooley is probably the last remaining Republican in California that actually had a lot of political clout. So for her to tackle Cooley was a real difficult race. And it was a real good year for Democrats because it was a year that Democrats outperformed Republicans all across the board in California. But her race with Cooley was the margin was very, very slim. In fact, she believed that she lost her first race for attorney general when on election day, and even papers had already declared Cooley the winner. It wasn't until 3 weeks later, when all the votes were counted and all the ballots were recounted, did they finally declare Harris the winner, just winning by a very, very slim margin.
So her gamble paid off. She must have been reasonably competent just to survive statewide, even if she survived by a narrow margin. I mean, it's a hugely complex state. She then gets reelected. She gets elected to the U.S. Senate. Again, how did that work out?
At the time when she was looking for her next political career, obviously after she was reelected as Attorney General, she announced her plans for her political future shortly after her inauguration. She didn't even spend much time because there was a unique opportunity. And her and Gavin Newsom at the time were both sort of eyeing this idea of running for California governor. Many California Democrats were not happy with this idea because they were two very popular rising Democrats. And the last thing they wanted was to see this ugly collision as they fought it out in a potential primary for Democratic governor. At this time, suddenly Senator Barbara Boxer announces her decision to resign from her seat and step down. That sort of opens up a release valve in this sort of pressurized environment. Kamala Harris makes it very clear that she wants to run for the Senate office. She goes out right away and issues a statement saying that she will run, much to the relief of Gavin Newsom, who had his own political ambitions at home. For Harris, it seemed like it was a bit of a calculation, right? And if I can run and win a race for Senate, maybe this would be a better place to pursue my political career, rather than getting bogged down in the gubernatorial aspects of California and trying to run for future office as a governor of California. Maybe I can go the Obama route, right, and pursue higher office through the Senate. She already had all of the Democratic donors, the top Democratic strategists on her side, so she was able to run pretty effectively against another Democrat and easily beat her in the primary.
In a sense, the San Francisco Mafia divided up. One of them gets to be governor, the other one gets to be the U.S. senator. And she had a lot of support. I mean, to her credit, she had a ton of people favoring her. I mean, Elizabeth Warren, Cory Booker, Kirsten Gillibrand are all on her side. I think she clearly has support from the Obama administration, which had at one point asked her if she wanted to be Attorney General of the United States. So there's a certain affection there, apparently. And in the end, she got to be the senator. But as you reported, once she's in the Senate, she actually doesn't work as a senator. She is sort of following the Obama model of focusing on running for president. You don't need to be a very good senator if you don't intend to be there.
Right. I think fellow senators saw right away that certainly during her victory speech in California was a time of great sorrow for the Democratic Party because in 2016, Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton for the presidency. And so Harris quickly rewrote her victory speech to, not only declare victory, but really position herself for future power. She famously told Democrats not to lose hope, to fight, and that she was going to Washington to continue this fight against the Trump administration, and urged Democrats not to be sad or fearful, and that she was going to be sort of the new superhero of this Democratic fight to oppose Donald Trump and his agenda. And when she first arrived in Washington, she was among the very prominent group of senators. As a newly elected senator, she was there to participate in the Women's March, declaring her intention to continue fighting for women and women's issues. And again, trying to rally the Democratic Party. So early on, she had this sort of mantra that she was going to be this sort of the fighting future of the Democratic Party now that they had lost Hillary Clinton.
And in the same time, she's very close to Bernie Sanders. She's sort of moving from the left to the further left in this process.
Exactly. At this point, I think Harris and her advisors are purposefully positioning herself to the left, thinking that if I can just get as far left as Bernie Sanders without actually being Bernie Sanders, Democrat primary voters will reward me for this. And, it's not necessarily a problem if you're the senator of California, because if you pursue all of these controversial issues, your voters back at home aren't going to punish you. They're going to tend to agree with you. At least a majority of the voters there will agree with you. So Harris spends a lot of time in her first years of the Senate. No leftist position is too radical for her to pick up and run with, really doing everything she can to sort of endear herself with the sort of more radical Democratic primary voters.
I mean, she's not there very long before she turns right around. And on January 21st, 2019, she's on Good Morning America announcing she's running for president. That lasts not quite a year. What do you think happened? I mean, she'd been a decent candidate in California, and boom, somehow she melts, and she kicks off with like 20,000 people in Oakland. So you'd think she's reasonably popular, she's a reasonably good organizer, and then for 11 months she just keeps decaying. What do you think happened?
Right. I think that Kamala Harris failed to properly lead her presidential campaign. She didn't necessarily have a deep-seated vision for why she was running. She was just looking for power's sake. She relied too much on her consultants who had helped her greatly in California, had properly coached her up, got her ready for battle, spent significant funds on TV advertising, which makes a great deal of difference in California, which is a massive media market. And I think she tried to use those same strengths in a presidential primary. Well, you know as well as I do, you can't just go to Iowa and paper the local television network with ads and talk about how great you are unless you go to all of these events and have a personal connection with the voters and speak to them as if you care about their votes. I think she ran into what so many senators ran into during this cycle. And, Harris was not the only sort of senator who thought that they could be the next Obama. There were a whole host of Democratic senators who went to Iowa thinking that they could endear themselves to Iowa voters to become the new figurehead of the Democratic Party. But so many of them failed, not only because they were splitting time between their job in the Senate and their time in Iowa, but really had lost the ability. I don't know if even Harris had the ability to really speak to voters in a genuine, authentic way and connect with them in a way that boosted her support. She certainly had the support of all the Democratic elite media people and the Democratic donors. People saw her as a real threat to the Trump campaign and certainly to her Democratic colleagues. She ultimately found herself struggling, trying to reboot her campaign on several different occasions. And one of those attempts was when she famously clashed with Joe Biden during the primary debate in the summer of 2019.
Given her role in the elites of San Francisco, I would think that wandering around Decorah, Iowa, or Sioux City or whatever would be an interesting experience and probably not be in her strength. Nonetheless, she doesn't seem to do all that well in the debates, and money dries up and she disappears. I'm not sure I thought that very, very weak performance in 19 would lead to becoming the vice presidential candidate in 20.
Right. It was shocking that she was once considered among the top candidates in the 2019 primary and ended up having to end her campaign before the Iowa caucuses even began. And a lot of people speculated that she didn't want to lose by an enormous margin in California, her home state. There was also reports of infighting, staff furious with the direction of the campaign, different advisors pointing fingers at other people to blame. And ultimately, Harris sort of ran out of money and just had to call it quits. So she really finished off her presidential campaign in a much weaker place. But at the same time, there was also this simmering issue going forward with the Black Lives Matter riots and the summer of 2020 that sort of gave her a possible opening when it came to Biden, the Democratic nominee, to choose his running mate.
There was a rumor that the deal that was offered by the Democratic whip in South Carolina was that if Biden would pick Harris, that he would make sure he won South Carolina. And if he won South Carolina, he would go on to win the nomination.
I don't think it was necessarily Kamala Harris per se, but Clyburn leaned very heavily on Biden that now was the time to choose a woman of color to serve as a running mate, as a vice presidential candidate. He saw that as a perfect opening for Biden. He certainly exacted a promise by Biden to appoint a woman of color to the Supreme Court. And then Biden ultimately, during the primary debates, promised that he would pick a woman running mate before he was finally nominated in the primary process.
Do we have any notion of where Obama was in this process?
It's very interesting because when Biden's looking at different candidates, he obviously vowed to pick a woman as a running mate, but then there's a lot of pressure from Clyburn and African-American activists to pick a woman of color. Certainly the Biden family had long appreciated Harris, but until the debate moment in the 2019 summer, when she famously saying, "I don't believe you're a racist, but you're kind of a racist for working with segregationist senators and pursuing and opposing ideas of public busing." The Biden family was not a Kamala Harris fan, even though she was a significant candidate on the stage as someone who had run for president and had been thoroughly examined. So Biden was considering other African-American candidates, and certainly Nancy Pelosi offered other choices, such as Val Demings. Even the Biden family was willing to consider former National Security Advisor for President Obama, Susan Rice, actually on top of Biden's list as they continued on their search. But certainly Obama had appreciated Kamala Harris from the past, and reports note that he did a good job advocating for Biden to let go of the past and select her, despite everything between them.
So when she ends up as a nominee, and then as they win the election, what kind of vice president is she initially?
Well, initially they sort of kicked off the idea of COVID recovery and getting the vaccine distributed. And so she's very much sort of thrust in this position where the president wants her to focus on pushing the vaccine to the Black community. And so a big part of her first few months are acting in this role where she's a little bit thin-skinned and upset that she's sort of targeted with these issues, the sort of the women's issues and the issues that matter to people of color. But at the same time, she's trying to work and be a good partner despite everything that she's experienced. Ultimately, when the Biden administration really needed her to take tough issues off of his plate, that's when Harris sort of goes rogue.
Do they get closer together or further apart in this process?
Further apart. I think in the beginning, Joe Biden felt like he wanted a buddy vice president, someone who could really work hand in hand and work together on his issues. But he soon discovered that Harris was not interested in helping him or take the lead on his issues. She had a very survival instinct, working to protect her political brand from that of Biden's political brand. So famously, this sort of took root or first revealed itself during the entire conversation over the migrant crisis, which, had already reached its peak. Well, maybe not its peak, but it had already reached a significant problem in the first few months of their administration.
Part of what seems to be going on is just sheer chaos. I mean, she had something like a 92% turnover rate in staff in her first 3 years. Isn't that sort of extraordinary?
Right. In Washington, people are willing to put up with a certain amount of abuse if your boss is rising and actually doing well. And you can certainly make an argument for why you should stick in the position if you want to build up your political profile. But in this case, Harris was so difficult to work for. There were reports of her being famously demanding. She would ridicule and bully the staff. There were instances where she failed to do the proper preparations for an event or a speech, and then would berate her staff when she made mistakes. So that prompted what we see now as 92% of her original staff to leave her office. And even just in the first 18 months, there was already significant staff turnover. And that really led a lot of people in Washington to sort of write her off as someone who was a political novice and wasn't ready for the job.
She also had this strange laugh, which I think became a liability because it made her seem like she was a lightweight.
I talk to people about the laugh a lot because it's a defining part of Kamala Harris, and certainly her critics sort of deride her for her cackle. But it's not unusual for a politician to have an annoying laugh or a laugh that isn't appreciated by the wide spectrum of the American people, but it's how you use that laugh. And in Harris's situation, she frequently used her laugh to sort of laugh off tough questions. And there are multiple incidences of her in her vice presidency when she's approached by reporters or when she was doing a real interview with television anchors. When they would ask her some of these tough questions, she would usually laugh and shrug her shoulders in a way to try to disarm these questions. But it really came off as kind of as if she wasn't taking the issue seriously. So it's a very bad look for a politician who's trying to make a name for themselves.
It made her look like a lightweight. And then you get into this strange question of, was she the border czar, not the border czar? What did it mean to take the lead on diplomatic work with Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras? And now, of course, you have the news media desperately trying to backtrack and literally in some cases, eliminating their archives. I've never seen anything quite like it, to go back and take out the article that used the term border czar because they were trying to prove she wasn't the border czar. As you looked at all that material during the period it was happening, what did you think?
Yeah, it was during the first few months of the Biden presidency, there was this issue of the unaccompanied migrants and the migrants flooding across the border. And it was a major issue. And the Biden administration initially tried to say it wasn't a crisis, it wasn't a problem, until it got so bad that it was very clearly a crisis and that they needed to sort of appoint a point person on this. And, being in Washington, you can at some point, an administration has to take action and pretend like they have heard the complaints and have seen the leadership void and are now prepared to act to fix a problem. And in this case, Team Biden immediately thinks of Kamala Harris as the solution. And look, she's had time living in a border state. Maybe she can go and take the lead on this, just like Vice President Joe Biden did for Barack Obama. And famously, Obama appointed him to also take the lead on immigration, to work on solving some of these root causes. And the term border czar is not an official position. And usually when you're seen as a czar, right, this is sort of a media title given to the point person of an administration who's going to take the issue seriously. And it's happened throughout our history where, this person is there to take the issue off the president's plate so he can continue without the political difficulties.
Just based on what you saw in the period that this was going on, is it fair to say that she had been appointed border czar?
Right, because the Biden administration pushed her forward to take the lead on the issue, primarily by sending her to Guatemala, where she delivered the Biden administration's message to the migrants there: do not come. Do not come. I believe that if you will become, you will be turned away. That's what she said during the press conference. Well, the migrants obviously didn't see that as an authentic message, coming over even quicker. And so the Biden administration put her in these positions, certainly, to do an interview with Lester Holt of NBC to make the case that the Biden administration was taking the issue seriously. She famously said, yes, I haven't been to the border, but I haven't been to Europe either, and sort of laughed off that question.
Did that strike you as weird?
Yes. Democrats also found this unbelievable because Republicans had been asking this question for months, and she wasn't even prepared to answer the simplest of questions during the interview.
I didn't mind the first half of the answer, no, I'm not done. But to have this pivot, and I haven't been to Europe either, you have to wonder what was the synaptic process in her brain.
Staffers had prepared her for a completely different answer, but this was one she came off on the fly. Experienced politicians in Washington were not impressed by that performance.
We're trying to figure out a language to describe one aspect of her that's really, I think, different than any vice president I can remember, and that is the degree to which at times she's just unpresidential. I mean, you can't quite imagine a serious person doing this. So the first thing I want to raise, I think this is all weird, Charlie. She gets off on Venn diagrams. Listen to her describe the depth of her love of Venn diagrams.
I love Venn diagrams. I really do. I love Venn diagrams. It's just something about those three circles and the analysis about where there is the intersection, right? Remember Venn diagrams, those three circles? Right. And then let's just see where they overlap. You will not be surprised because I have constructed a Venn diagram on this. Remember those three circles, how they overlap? I love Venn diagrams. So I just do. Whenever you're dealing with conflict, pull out a Venn diagram, right? And so, the three circles. And so I asked my team, right? They're fantastic. Out right now he sees the Venn diagram of it all. He sees that there are those circles, and maybe people seem that they're a little different. They live in different parts of the country. They may be different age or different race. But that area in the middle, that overlap.
Now I ask you, what did that mean? What is going on in her brain at that point?
She has sort of these crutches that she will lean on, and she often refers to these things during a panel discussion or when there isn't a scripted teleprompter speech, when she's having a discussion panel. And one of her crutches was talking about Venn diagrams, because if you can visualize a Venn diagram, then she could put three different issues and try to combine them in a way that would make sense to her audience. But it became such a big crutch, people started noticing and started pulling out the different times she kept leaning on this idea of trying to publicly draw a Venn diagram in front of an audience, that's a very monumental rhetorical task. Certainly Harris started to do it a little more less as it became more and more laughable.
During a White House reception for Women's History Month in March of 2023, she goes all over the place. Listen to her for a second.
So during Women's History Month, we celebrate and we honor the women who made history throughout history, who saw what could be unburdened by what had been. We see the suffragists, the riveters, the marchers, the mothers and sisters and aunts and grandmothers and daughters, all the giants upon whose broad shoulders we stand. For generations, women have continued to make incredible progress in the classroom, in the workplace, in the halls of government. And we are all here, evidence of that progress.
I mean, she has this tendency to use words repetitively as if repeating them somehow gives them meaning.
Right. That's exactly right. How she gets caught up in these kind of what's described as word salads by people who sort of monitor her public speeches. And in this, she continues to offer more and more independent clauses on her sentences to try to emphasize her point. But the more she drops more and more dependent clauses, then her sentence becomes very burdened down with all of her different words in spite of her constantly repeating herself. This is what ends her up with this reputation of, if she's speaking off the cuff, it tends to spiral into word salads, and it's not a good look.
Well, my favorite, I think, just because it could almost be a scene from a comedy, is Harris trying to explain artificial intelligence. Listen to this for a second to the vice president's explanation of artificial intelligence.
And I think the first part of this issue that should be articulated is AI is kind of a fancy thing. It's, first of all, it's 2 letters. It means artificial intelligence. But ultimately what it is it's about machine learning. And so the machine is taught. And part of the issue here is what information is going into the machine that will then determine, and we can predict then, if we think about what information is going in, what then will be produced in terms of decisions and opinions that may be made through that process.
How do you explain this?
Yeah, it's really hard. It's a scene where she's speaking to experts in the AI scene, but somehow feels like it's necessary for her to define each word as if these industry leaders in AI don't necessarily understand what they're there for. So it's one case of not understanding your audience. In public speaking, right? There's always this option, like, how do I make an impact on my public speech? By defining each term individually. And this is kind of what happens to lawyers and prosecutors who move into politics. They tend to focus too much time trying to define the words that they're using rather than using the words in a very passionate and approachable way.
Let me ask you, in terms of current events, were you surprised when Biden stepped down and endorsed Harris to take on the nomination?
Yes, we published this book in January, and so we had the idea that this was a possibility. And even in our introduction, we wrote sort of what it would look like when Biden and his advisors realized it was time to go, and the fears that would be in their minds as they were realizing that Kamala Harris was going to take his place. We successfully predicted that. I don't think I was ever prepared for it to happen so quickly before the election and so rapidly to have Biden endorse her in the same breath.
And were you surprised at how rapidly the left and the Democratic Party closed ranks?
I was, which suggests that there was a little bit of work behind the scenes by, certainly not by Harris herself, but by the party apparatus at large. I believe that they were sort of encouraged to get behind Harris and that there was definitely a right of succession that they preferred rather than a messy nomination process. I think Democrats are known for wanting to keep things neat and tidy without it devolving into a populist mess.
You've studied Kamala Harris as candidate for the district attorney, candidate for attorney general, candidate for the U.S. Senate, candidate for president. Do you think that we are likely to see the Kamala Harris who couldn't survive the first year of being a candidate for president? Or do you think she has, between what she's learned over the last 4 years, plus the sheer quality of the Obama team, which is now going to come in and help her, do you think she becomes dramatically more formidable than her past record would imply?
It's difficult because in this modern era, one of the most powerful aspects of your candidacy is the ability to be authentic. And Kamala Harris doesn't have that ability to be authentic. She's very risk averse, and she's been very focused on staying on script just in the past couple of years. Gone are the word salads, gone are these moments of approachability or her attempt to reach out and connect with voters. It's completely gone. So effectively, you have the Biden campaign running their basement strategy, right? Keep him in the basement, get him on camera as infrequently as possible, keep him from making mistakes. She's effectively running that same basement campaign when she has no reason to do so. So I really think that she's going to struggle with authenticity, even though she will become more risk averse, more scripted as she moves forward into the presidential campaign.
Let me risk showing my partisan bias. I have a hunch that she's very authentic. She is authentically what we see, and that will be unavoidable. You can't run 94 days. In the age of television and the level of scrutiny at the presidential level, in the end, you are who you are.
That's correct. And she is a longtime establishment politician who has successfully been the puppet of business interests and politicians and donors on her behalf. And she has successfully leveraged her entire career onto the Democratic stage, demanding these positions of power and receiving them. And that ultimately, now that she's positioned for the top job without ever winning a vote from Democratic voters for her to be the nominee, she will be revealed as the person she is. I think you're absolutely right.
Well, listen, I want to thank you for joining me. I think given her role now in American politics and history, your book, Amateur Hour, Kamala Harris in the White House, it's available now on Amazon, in bookstores everywhere. I think anyone who wants to get an in-depth look at who Kamala Harris really is going to find this as a must-read. You've done a great job. Your timing is as good as any author I've ever seen. And I wish you really well for having written this.
Thanks so much.
Thank you to my guest, Charlie Spiering. You can get a link to buy his new book, Amateur Hour, Kamala Harris in the White House, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.